just shade. It is also other factors that I'll go into here in a bit. And then we'll also talk about the nutrient and biotic integrity of these aquatic communities. So I'll start with the biotic and nutrient exchange. Many of you probably know of the river continuum concept. This basically describes how the aquatic ecology of the system changes, focusing primarily on the macroinvertebrate community, but also on fish as well. And what we notice is that there's a distribution of aquatic organisms changed as you go from low order streams up in the headwaters, up in here, to larger order streams down as you get closer to the ocean. And these changes in observed patterns of biotic communities are driven primarily by processes that are going on in the riparian zone as well as in the fluvial network. We also notice that one of the key drivers here is the change in source materials. You'll notice these headwater areas up in here are dominated by closed canopy. A lot of that canopy ends up recruiting into the aquatic environment, whereas down in the larger areas, the riparian canopy has a lot less effect. In the riparian, or in the forested area, we tend to be more in the upper reaches of that continuum concept, where riparian leaf litter is an important food source. You'll notice the distribution of aquatic communities here, that shredders, and which are aquatic organisms that shred the leaf litter, are a fairly significant component of the entire aquatic community. What we also know is that the quality of that leaf litter is important, and by far the highest value are nitrogen-fixing species like alder, red alder in the riparian zone. And one of the concerns that people have raised in recent years is in the effort to convert many of the riparian areas away from alder and into conifer, primarily because of the role that conifer has in recruiting large woody debris, we've reduced significantly the amount of nutrient exchange that goes on in a lot of these forested communities. We'll talk about more of that later. When it comes to nutrient quality, some of the other species that have more moderate values are things like maple, willow, and cottonwood. And then the poorest quality by far are oaks and conifer, which generally don't have nutrients that are very bioavailable. One of the other factors that's important is the amount of canopy closure that occurs in these streams. If you have very tight canopy closure like in this photo, there's very little solar light that can reach the stream, and therefore your primary productivity is reduced. The amount of solar activity also affects temperature, and temperature is a strong driver in the biogeochemical processes that are going on in the stream. And so there's kind of an optimal range in which we've got enough light coming in to keep the system warm enough to be generating a lot of activity versus being too warm that it might cause the temperatures to spike or cause organisms to be outside of their operable ranges. So a condition that looks more like this, where you've got good canopy closure but some light that can enter into the system, tends to be more of an ideal state. There are also trade-offs between the nutrient exchange and thermal functions, both in terms of the shade trade-off, which I'll talk about here in a bit, the response to wood recruitment potential, and also the response of flooding and water risks that I won't go into too much today. One of the key drivers, at least with regard to salmon production, is in this diagram you can see we talk about the life cycle of salmonids, and in the freshwater area, they start off as eggs. They move to a smolt condition before they move out into the ocean. What we know is that when the fish smolt and go out to sea, and if the smolt sizes are generally too small, we know that their return as feeding adults tends to be significantly reduced. Basically, if they're too small, they predominantly are fish food in the ocean. So our goal is to try to get them, to get the smolt sizes up so that they're larger when they go out in the ocean. That dramatically increases their survival rates, which increases their rates of returning spawning adults. In order to do that, we know that no-cut buffers may forego the opportunity to increase fish growth and biomass or to manage other functions. And there's been some excellent work by Ken Cummins, who will be talking later in this webinar series about some of the new thinking around this. One of the findings that we found, and this slide I think is a little bit out of order, so I apologize here, but one of the findings we found was that basically a 100-foot no-cut buffer on both sides of the streams provided conditions similar to a no-harvest level when it came to biotic and nutrient recovery. So there is opportunity within that 100-foot range to improve conditions for certain functions, but generally once you got beyond about 100 foot, it was difficult to distinguish any significant changes in the system. Let me transition to heat exchange functions. Heat exchange in riparian communities is driven by thermodynamic processes. I won't go into this long equation here in too much gory detail, but this is basically a physical law, the second law of thermodynamics. And we know that there are certain incoming and outgoing sources of energy that are affected by riparian communities. We have the amount of heat that comes in from direct solar radiation. We have, which is net additive. We have heat from atmospheric long-wave radiation, which comes in. We have long-wave radiation that's re-emitted from the surface that goes back out, that it reduces the temperature or draws that heat away from the stream, kind of like the stream sweating, if you will. We have nutrient exchange from evaporative cooling, and the heat transfer from both the subsurface coming in and the lateral or longitudinal heat transfer processes as warm water moves downstream. Riparian shade helps to control heat input to streams, but there are other factors that are important too, and I think in recent years, shading has been often the dominant variable that is managed, but understanding how these other functions affect the overall thermal regime is important if you're going to start actively managing the system. Some of these different functions here, and I won't go into all of these, but they include things like the channel slope, channel width, stream bed topography, the pattern of the stream, riparian zone vegetation, the alluvial aquifer and how much hyporheic flow and exchange there is, what the condition of that hyporheic exchange looks like. So it can get fairly complicated, and what we also know is that there are thermal growth curves related to fish that are important. Basically, what these plots show is that there is a relationship between the growth rate and the temperature, such that there is an optimum range, generally here seen as this kind of line here at the top, where fish productivity is ideal, and that's usually somewhere between about 14 degrees C and about 18 degrees C, and it varies slightly by species. But the take-home message is there's a zone in which you're going to have optimum fish production, and then there's also a zone of temperature regimes in which you're going to have very strong nutrient exchange. So typically what will happen is if you have too cool of a stream, you can produce a lot of fish, but they'll be fairly small in size. And if you have a somewhat warmer system, you can produce a very few number of fish, but they'll be very large. And so what we're striving for is that kind of middle range where we can have a large number of fairly good-sized smolts that will have a strong potential returning as adults. So the key findings that we found in the literature review, to summarize, there was a relative importance and sensitivity of riparian vegetation to stream temperatures, and that it varied by geographic province. As you go from north to south in California, it changes. As you go west to east, it changes. That there were at least 11 site-specific factors that affect temperature, not just one, not just shade. And some of those factors are actually stronger controls for temperature than our shade. Shade is actually a fairly weak factor when you look at some of the multiple regression relationships between temperature and shade. So stream temperature targets can be helpful in managing to a desired shade condition, but not exclusive to it. We also found that there were no single fixed width buffers or canopy closure prescriptions that can regulate heat objectives for salmon in all cases, but that effective shading was generally provided by buffer widths ranging from 30 to 100 feet, and that as you went upstream and downstream, if you did have a canopy gap, for example, that canopy gap would re-equilibrate within about 500 to 650 feet. So if you're looking in some of the strategies that we'll talk about in a couple weeks, the idea of creating small gaps in the riparian community to allow for nitrogen-fixing species to come in, so you can have the benefit of both the nutrient exchange, but not setting it up so that these are so big that they start affecting temperature negatively. Another factor that is important, and this also comes from that FEMAT report, was the relationship between riparian buffer effects on microclimate. And one of the things that we discovered was that there was actually very little effect between microclimate and stream temperatures, although there is a very well-defined effect between riparian structure and microclimate. So if you're concerned about other species beyond salmonids or aquatic organisms, but maybe amphibians who have to be sensitive to air temperature, if you're concerned about maybe bird species or other terrestrial species that are sensitive to different microclimate effects, then those factors need to be considered. But with regard to the aquatic community itself, we couldn't make the relationship between microclimate and stream temperature. And that's basically what I just said. One of the other findings we found was that shade conditions inversely influence biotic and nutrient exchange functions. In other words, if you have a lot of shade, you have very low biotic productivity and very long nutrient exchange functions. I'm going to briefly touch on water exchange functions. We talked about this in the riparian literature review. Basically, the take-home message was there was very little in the reviewed literature that can be used to directly address the issue of buffer strip delineation as regards to water. In other words, the only influence that the riparian community can have is the interception of precipitation, and the riparian strips are generally very small relative to the size of the entire watershed, and therefore we couldn't distinguish, or science has been unable to date, distinguish any difference in the riparian community. So the effects of riparian management on water functions and hydrologic functions are likely to be small. They're likely to be highly variable. They're influenced by the watershed context, things like the watershed shape, orientation, composition, things like that, and that the impacts are generally mixed. So there was little direct evidence of riparian effects, and the most sensitive hydrologic areas may be the steep zero-order basins, and that's primarily because they may affect soil moisture and therefore the potential for spring development and or the potential for steep slopes failure, but that was not a focus of the work that we've done to date. We also found that there were soil compaction issues that can easily be addressed by just limiting exclusion or excluding heavy equipment near streams. And that we also found that there was an important hyporheic process. Hyporheic zones, for some of you who may not be familiar with that term, is the dynamics of water going from the surface water into the groundwater and then back into the surface water. This happens at riffles. It happens in areas where you have very strong coupling between the substrate of the channel and the local groundwater regime. The challenge from a management perspective is that we just don't know a lot about these systems yet. It's only been researched here for about 10 years or so, so we're still kind of working on that. So wood exchange functions. Wood has been primarily one of the most important functions that riparian buffer strategies have been managed around for the last few years, primarily because a lot of the work in the mid to late 90s showed the importance of wood in aquatic productivity and aquatic function. But what we do know about wood in the forest riparian domain is that there's a relationship with the channel size and the effectiveness in wood in forming aquatic habitats. So what we see here is that as you go from your headwater systems, you generally have a variable effectiveness. Wood often tends to be, these channels tend to be confined, so they tend to be steep. They tend to have very steep side slopes or hill slopes that go down into the channel. So when wood falls, it tends to span over the channel. It doesn't directly interfere or influence the fluvial environment. And by the time it breaks down enough to drop into the channel, it usually has a very low residence time. It's usually decayed enough that at that point where it'll break down and move down slope fairly quickly. Not always, but generally the wood functions are lower there. As you move downstream, wood functions become more important. Generally, we find the systems that are where wood has the biggest influence are those systems that are about between 2 and 4%. These are the systems that Montgomery and Buffington called the forced pool riffle systems, where they were pool riffle because of the contribution of wood. The wood basically forced the channel into a pool riffle environment, and that if you pull out the wood, you would lose a lot of that habitat quality, and you would end up with like a plain bed or a very, very simple system. What this plot doesn't show is that when you get to sizes of channels where the channel width is greater than about a site potential tree height, that the role of wood starts to change. It doesn't have the same immediate effect in terms of creating pools and spawning gravels, but it tends to float through the river network and accumulate in meander bends. So it tends to play a role primarily in bank protection, in large woody debris jams that will occur in different areas. And that kind of goes beyond the scope and scale of what we're looking at here, but it's still an important function. What we do know is when we look at the large woody debris source areas, if you are looking at basically 4 different types of recruitment process. There's bank erosion, where the stream migrates, causes the bank to erode. As the bank gets undercut, the tree that's sitting on top of the bank falls into the stream. That, in California, there's some work that Lee Benda has done. He'll talk about that, I think, in 3 weeks, where about 40 to 60% of the wood recruitment that we observe in California comes from bank erosion. The source distances for these types of systems tend to be less than about 30 feet. It's hard to erode the bank 150 feet away from the channel. So there's kind of a limited range there. One of the other dominant sources is stream-adjacent landslides. They were responsible for about 30% of the total wood recruitment in California, or at least in the north coast of California. And the source distances tend to be up to about 200 feet or so. And then there's 2 types of tree fall, which, interestingly, most of the riparian rules have been defined based on this concept of tree fall. You know, what is the source distance of a tree falling in the woods and then intersecting the channel? But what we're finding is that only about 10 to 30% of the proportion of absorbed wood in the system comes from tree fall. And it's difficult to tell whether that's from wind throw or from mortality. Mortality being the tree just dies and falls in. Usually it snags or something like that, versus wind throw, where the wind, storms, events may knock something over. In mortality, we find the recruitment distance tends to be restricted up to about 100 feet. Even if you've got a taller tree, by the time it's that far out, you're only getting the top of the tree into the stream, and it generally doesn't have much function at that point. But then we find that trees that are dominated by wind throw can get a little bit larger, up to about 130 feet. Primary reason for that is there seems to be a interesting dynamic in which wind throw tends to force trees to fall perpendicular to the channel. And there's a lot of debate as to why that is. I think some of those studies predominantly come out of the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, where clear cutting or large gap cutting is still a dominant mechanism. And then what happens, independent of the orientation of the wind, you'd get these shear zones that set up, which create these stresses that end up going perpendicular to the channel, and that's why you tend to get more recruitment there. The other major factors that are reported to influence wood recruitment include things like the existing stand density, composition, and structure. So this kind of goes back to some of the work that was done in the 1990s by Chad Oliver and Bruce Larson that looked at different phases of mortality. When you're in a system where you tend to have these decade-long periods when there tends to be high mortality in a stand, those tend to be the periods in which you're most likely to get a lot of wood recruitment. And then after that mortality stops and you get like an understory reinitiation condition, you don't have that mortality, so your recruitment tends to slow down a little bit. So those are important factors. Other factors to consider are stream type, order, and watershed context, vegetation type and soil type index, what's your site potential tree height, whether you're looking at conifer, hardwood, or mixed sands. There's different variations regionally, depending on climate and some other factors, geology. And then the disturbance is a very key factor. Understanding your disturbance regime will affect your wood recruitment potential. As I mentioned, wood in-stream can move downstream through flood in larger systems, and here's an example of some wood that's accumulating in the river environment. There were reports in the Pacific Northwest by some of the first explorers there, where they found 1.5 to 2 mile long wood jams that were choking some of the major rivers in the Pacific Northwest. And there's some thinking that that was one of the reasons that area had such great habitat. some point. You also get these debris flow jams and low order streams, which tend to bring in a lot of wood onto the margins, and you can see that there's a nice forming pool associated with these things. You tend to get ripples and bars that form adjacent to them. So they have a lot of geomorphic influence. What we're finding is that debris flow confluence areas tend to contribute to biological hotspots, and some of the work that Gordy Reeves has done out of Oregon State has contributed to some of that thinking. So wood recruitment potential depends on the existing stand conditions, the successional pathway of those stands. We can kind of project how stands are going to evolve into the future using a lot of, stand mortality models, cryptos and other kinds of stand growth and yield modeling, and the disturbance regime. Whether you're whether you have a dominant bank erosion condition, i.e. a channel that's actively migrating, versus a system that maybe is dominated by landslides, versus a system that might be dominated by wind throw or other mortality-different processes. So those are all, they vary over the landscape. Knowing where you are is kind of important to understanding that system. Forest management can influence these natural disturbance regimes specifically by affecting how disturbances occur. So changing the fire frequency regime, for example, can influence wood recruitment. How large the disturbances are, and which type of disturbances are likely. We also know that active management can manipulate the riparian structure in ways that affect the growth and mortality dynamics for the stand. So if you're looking to increase the tree diameter, for example, because the trees in the riparian zone are too small to contribute to the function of the channel, then you might want to do some riparian thinning to increase the growth of those trees. By contrast, if you have conditions where the stem diameter is of sufficient size to be geomorphically effective, but you don't have enough mortality, you may want to do things to encourage mortality. One of the ways you can encourage mortality is to actually knock the tree over into the stream, and there's been some active wood placement projects that have been going on in the North Coast in recent years, and we're also going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. Finally, I want to talk about the sediment exchange functions. Sediment sources from forest management include a lot of different processes, surface erosion, skid trails, roads, bank erosion, etc. I won't go into all of these, but the idea is to understand where your sediment sources are, and generally you're better off treating the source areas, not trying to rely on the riparian buffer to treat sediment delivery. The best way to do this is to look at these things called source controls, which are best management practices that prevent the erosion from happening to begin. The next best effect is runoff controls, so treating the sediment in the rills or small channels or other conveyances, ditches, for example, so that sediment doesn't get delivered to the channel. And then the least effective and most costly are typically treatment controls, and these are the ones that, we've already got the sediment entrained in the channel or in the water column, and you're trying to filter it out before it gets into the stream, and that's by far the most complicated. And so generally speaking, riparian communities tend to fall into this runoff and or treatment control category. You're generally better off trying to get stuff at its source. What we found in the literature was that riparian buffers are generally effective at limiting sediment delivery from surface runoff processes. We found that anything out beyond a core zone, about 30 feet, was pretty good at mitigating the sediment productivity. In the absence of buffers, the ground disturbances that are near streams have the potential to deliver sediment. that selective forest management within buffers does not appear to substantially increase sediment productivity or delivery. So it basically, looking at a number of studies have been done, when you go in and actively manage the riparian stand without heavy equipment, or by reaching in and grabbing equipment, or grabbing trees, or yarding by highline or skyline type of yarding systems, you can minimize the amount of sediment delivery. And then the potential, the extent that riparian buffers along headwater streams are necessary to prevent sediment delivery was not really reviewed by our literature. We do know that they can be a significant source of sediment. We also know that there is very clear evidence that when you actively manage a landscape, that sediment productivity in the streams tends to increase. And that's probably the source of these headwater areas. Just kind of what I just said here in this statement on that slide. And then finally, the source distance relationships for sediment appear to vary with dominant processes and site conditions, and understanding the context of where you are is important. The focus for managing sediment should be focusing on harvest-related sediment, trying to minimize the productivity there, focusing on the hydrologic link to sediment delivery. So even though if you might generate sediment from the harvest activity, preventing it from delivering is important. Road sediment is probably the biggest source of sediment out there, and if you can mitigate that road sediment, you can have a pretty good effect on mitigating the overall sediment picture. And then mass wasting impacts is the other area that needs to be considered. So we've talked about these four different functions here. We've got sediment functions, the wood functions, the thermal regulation functions, and the biotic and nutrient functions. And I think that's the last slide I've got on this talk. So,
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Mike? Hello?
yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, this is Richard again, and so now we can take a couple questions if there are some. Thanks a lot, Mike. I wanted to mention, and I'm bringing it into the middle here, there is a, you can access the literature review that Mike was talking about at the URL that you see on your screen there. And you might find that very helpful. It's a very comprehensive review. So we have a couple of questions. We're running a little bit late, so if there are a couple of questions for Mike, let us know what they are by typing them in the chat box. I might note to you also, if you go to the web page for this webinar, you'll find that there's some resources there, the documents that are, you'll see a resources link, and there's some documents that you can download. So feel free to go and browse that page and see what you can find. Because we've uploaded several documents that you might find useful and very helpful. It seems like we don't have any questions. Oh, here we go. John Knight is asking, did you quantify what is the largest sediment source? And I'm presuming that of those sources that you were talking about, what did you find?
Well, I think it varies significantly by context, where you are in the landscape. Geology has a huge effect on sediment sources. But in the forest domain, generally speaking, I think there's pretty good consensus that there are, well, first of all, I should back up. There's kind of two different kinds of sediment. We tend to not distinguish between the two. two types of, and there's actually a lot of different types of sediment, but the two dominant types are sediment that are good for aquatic organisms and sediment that's bad. The bad sediment are generally the fines. These tend to be sands and silts and clays that accumulate in the channel that create turbidity, that bury redds, that embed spawning gravels that make it difficult for the fish to spawn in, that generally decline water quality. The primary source of that type of sediment tends to come from roads. The good sediment is the coarser sediment, usually gravels and cobbles, coarser sands, that provide the spawning gravels, that provide the channel substrate, that create for a mobile substrate that allows for pool formation and sediment sorting in bars and things like that are important to the aquatic community. The sediments from those areas tend to come from bank erosion and landsliding. So the idea is we don't want to exacerbate the rates of landsliding, because natural rates of landsliding seem to be important in contributing that coarse sediment load. But in terms of minimizing the amount of negative sediment, I'd say it's predominantly roads, and second would be predominantly management-related effects from equipment intersecting with the stream.
Mike, there's a couple more questions here, and we'll have to close with these two, and maybe you can briefly address them. How many studies exist about the impacts of fires in riparian zones? You mentioned 2 fires. Any documentation of results? I might mention that Joe McBride's presentation, which is going to be next, is going to talk about a couple of studies of fires in riparian zones. How many did you find, Mike?
I'm digging back into the recesses of my brain. We did this in 2008, so that was 5 years ago. It wasn't a lot at that time. I'd say there was probably only about a handful of studies that we looked at, maybe 10 to 12. Joe could probably talk to that more. Most of the papers we looked at were papers that he or his grad students had written.
Yeah, why don't we defer to Joe's, because he'll be talking about that at some length. Stefan would like to know about whether with warming climate, thermal relations may play out the same, or will there be some kind of changes? Want to make some kind of crystal ball guess on that one?
Well, it's interesting because these thermal the thermodynamics that affect stream temperature are physical laws. They're not biological. So it's actually fairly reasonable to predict how these things will respond. Generally, air temperature is probably the strongest correlate to stream temperature. So as air temperatures increase, you're going to see corresponding increases in stream temperature. The only thing that can mitigate against that stream temperature increase when air temperatures increase is the contribution from hyporheic flow. So I would expect that as climate increases and we see longer periods of drier, warmer temperatures, that we're going to see not only reductions in the volume of water in some of the channels, which will increase temperature loads, but we're also going to see a longer influence of the air temperature and probably less influence of the groundwater temperature. So there's certainly a chance that would affect conditions. Now, whether the biological communities will respond to that, that's kind of the $10 million question.